Hello, everyone. Welcome to this 10th webinar of the Economic of Francesco School. I'm Vittorio Pelligra. I'm professor of economic policy at the University of Cagliari, and I'm here today just to briefly introduce today's webinar and our, first of all, our keynote speaker, Professor Robert Sugden. I'm very glad to have Bob here today. Is a professor of economics at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, UK, and is also a fellow of the British Academy and one of the few recipients of the prestigious Leverhulme Personal Research Professorship. Bob has published extensively in scholarly journals such as American Economic Review, Econometrica, Economic Journal, Games and Economic Behavior, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and many other prestigious professional journals. Bob is a true pioneer, I think, we think, in areas such as the theory of choice under uncertainty, evolutionary game theory, the study of conventional and focal points, but also the methodology of behavioral and experimental economics. And for example, he has introduced, formalized, and test experimentally the role of emotions such as regret in decision theory and the role of reciprocity, the principle of reciprocity in the provision of public goods. And these concepts are nowadays well accepted by the profession, but 40 years ago when he introduced them were very bold and innovative hypotheses. I first met Bob in 1997 when I arrived at UEA for my master degree and then the PhD. And just a personal note, Bob was on leave that year, and so he wasn't teaching. Nevertheless, he agreed to meet me every 2 weeks to discuss whatever topic I was interested in. And that year we read together Beamore's book, Game Theory and Social Contract. And I think this is, just a little example to signify how a kind, devoted and inspiring mentor Bob has been to me and many other, I would say, generation of students. And his research is truly interdisciplinary, as he uses ideas from economics, psychology, philosophy, even evolutionary biology to investigate extremely relevant issues. And the nature, the functioning of the market is one of these big themes, which is central to his latest book, The Community of Advantage, and is also the topic of today's lecture. That's why I'm wearing a T-shirt that I bought years ago in Chicago. Okay. There will be Bob's presentation, and then 3 discussants, Valentina, Julia, and Federico, will comment on it, answering questions and making their own personal remarks. Technical note, the audience can access the Spanish and Portuguese live translation by clicking the link in the button in the Zoom interface. Okay, please, Bob, it's a great honor, and the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay. Is my screen now visible?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm very pleased to be invited to come to give this talk. As I think many of you know, I've got long years of relationships with probably many of you, but certainly the Italian end of this of your organisation. So anyway, How would you, if you remember George Bush, famously, someone, I think it was one of the election campaigns, and a reporter said to him, well, what about, you've told us all about what you've been, your sort of, your policy proposals as your platform, but, can you tell us something more, something deeper about what you're into? And he said, oh, the vision thing, you mean? And this idea, the sense that what this talk is about, in a way, it is the vision thing for economics. And it's partly based on work with joint work with Luigi Bruni. If you think, what's the big picture of economics? And particularly the big picture of the market as viewed by economists? And I think it's fair to say that certainly in the classical and neoclassical tradition, the big picture has traditionally focused the invisible hand, the idea of the public good coming about as the unintended consequence of the pursuit of self-interest mediated by the market, or the market as the mediator of self-interest that produces the public good. Classic statement by Smith, which I'm sure you will know, he says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. And we never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. So this is a kind of picture of the market as an arena of self-interest, but I mean, behind it, in a sense, there's an invisible hand in this picture that this has been, I mean, it's never quite clear exactly what he has in mind, but certainly there's a sort of providential idea that this is part of it. The market is part of a natural order that does achieve the public good, but the way in which it achieves it is through self-interest within the rules. And in modern economics, this is the idea that, or this has come to be the idea that in a competitive market, the pursuit of individual self-interest produces efficiency and preference satisfaction, or more sort of popularly might say wealth creation. And I think most neoclassical economists would say, well, the efficiency, the two things that matter are efficiency and distribution. Efficiency is creating the maximum, in a sense, roughly speaking, creating the maximum amount of wealth. And distribution is how you distribute between people. And the picture has been that the distribution of benefits is important, but that's a matter for governments. The job of the individual economic agent is to pursue self-interest, and that will create the efficiency. Now, for many opponents of mainstream economics, this picture reveals the, not immoral probably, but amoral nature of the market. The idea is the market is amoral. Because it's based on self-interested motivation. And in some of these, I'll give you some quotes in a moment, but at least some of the people who opponents of economics, they see this as a moral failure of economics. It's not just, it's a kind of moral limit of the markets, and then it's a moral failure of economics and economists, because we are supposed to be normalizing market motivation. We're sort of saying, well, it's okay, and like that sort of greedy is good thought, it's okay to be self-interested. And in this critique of the market and critique of economics, in its philosophically respectable forms, it's an application of virtue ethics. The critique is that market motivations are non-virtuous, and so it's, in a way, you have to have the market because the market is useful in creating wealth, but allowing the market to extend its domain too much into other domains of life will crowd out true virtues. And this talk, as a response to that critique, is presenting a view of the market that allows ordinary market transactions to be virtuous. Now, the virtue ethical critique. The founding fathers of virtue ethics, going back years, decades, centuries, not millennia, I should say, Aristotle and Aquinas, particularly. Now, but the modern spokespersons for this, particularly, I think, are the best. I mean, Elizabeth Anderson, Value in Ethics and Economics. Incidentally, when I was saying to Luigi, if you were there, that I was beginning to think that there was beginning to be reconciled to Sen. I was through reading something of Elizabeth Anderson's. But anyway, and Michael Sandel, his book What Money Can't Buy, which is the moral limits of market, which is actually really just a rehash of Elizabeth Anderson's ideas, and Michael Sandel's Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, which is a different track. So in virtue ethics, the focus is on moral character or human flourishing, not the consequence of actions as utilitarians would think of it, what morality is about, the consequence of actions, or in Kantianism, morality is about moral duties. The idea is moral character. And actions are seen as aiming at some good, or at least they ought to be. For any activity, type of activity, the good is what that type of action aims at, or is supposed to aim at, the telos. And here's a quote from Aristotle. Let us again return to the good we're seeking. Ask, what can it be? It seems different in different actions and arts. What then is the good of each? What's the good of each action or art? Surely that for whose sake everything else is done. In medicine, this is health. So the telos, the aim of medicine is health. In strategy, the telos is victory. The aim is to win. In architecture, it's a house. And virtue or excellence is understood in relation to the good. So virtue or excellence is domain specific. A virtue or excellence brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence and makes the work of that thing be done well. So it's what enables virtue is what enables you to, when working within an activity, to produce what is that activity's telos. Now, when Aristotle turns to economics, since it's it's hugely anachronistic to talk about this, but in a sense, Aristotle does talk about economics. And he says, well, now, repeating what Powell had said before, as there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends are also many. The end of the medical art is health, that of shipbuilding, a vessel, that of strategy, victory, and that of economics, wealth. So the telos of economics is wealth. And then he says, the life of money making, which is obviously the telos of economics, is wealth, making money. The life of money making is one undertaken under compulsion. And wealth is evidently not the good we're seeking, but it's merely useful and for the sake of something else. And the reason I use these quotes is because these two claims are still there. They're echoed in critiques of economics made by the modern virtue ethicists. And the first thought is, well, when people engage in economic activity, it's a sign of lack of autonomy. They're acting in some sense under compulsion. They're not doing it for the sake of the activity. They're kind of, you're undertaking under compulsion. I mean, basically under compulsion because you need to live. But and the motivation for economic activity is, this is Aristotle speaking, really. The motivation for economic activity is instrumental and therefore sort of inferior. The things that economic activity can achieve are merely useful. I don't think merely is a very odd word there, but merely useful and for the sake of something else. They're not kind of deep. And that thought is also in virtue ethics. So here's some quotes from virtue ethics. Wait a minute. Modern virtue ethicists, they realize, I would say reluctantly and condescendingly, that we have to have markets, but they see the markets are kind of necessary evil. It's there to create the wealth. We can't really avoid this, but it's liable to corrupt through virtues. So it's necessary to keep the market within strict bounds. If economics doesn't recognize these bounds, it's morally corrupting. It's legitimizing the erosion of virtue. And here's Anderson, Elizabeth Anderson, on the moral limits of markets. And she says, well, she proposes a pluralist theory of value, in which there are different kinds of goods that ought to be valued in different ways. What's an economic good? It's a pure commodity, she says. And the mode of valuation appropriate to pure commodities is use. Use is, this is a quote, use is a lower, impersonal, and exclusive mode of valuation. It's contrasted with higher modes of valuation, such as respect. To merely use something is to subordinate it to one's own ends without regard for its intrinsic value. So this is the kind of charge sheet against economics, in the sense that economics is about commodities. The only sort of the way in which commodities are valued is in a low and impersonal way, as opposed to higher moral aims like respect and intrinsic value. And so he's noticed here the Aristotelian ranking of intrinsic value over instrumental value, and the idea that market norms are second rate, and the idea that they're impersonal, market norms are impersonal, i.e. they're not about relations between people, and they're egoistic. So that was, then here's my other virtue ethicist, Sandel. Sandel on justice, he says, justice is about, quote, giving people what they deserve. He says that requires judgments about, quote, what virtues are worthy of honour and reward, and what way of life a good society should promote. And then he says, well, the market it fails because it's unjust. It fails morally because it doesn't reward virtue. He says, well, it's obvious when I'm reading between the lines to some extent. He's clear. He thinks that as far as the market's concerned, as far as the telos of the market's concerned, effort and talent are the things that the market ought to be rewarding. But in fact, he says markets reward greed and luck. And his classic example of the greed and the luck is the hurricane, the time I was writing relatively recently, Hurricane Charlie, I think it attacked Florida. No, it might have been the Gulf states, but anyway, it's Southern America. And builders, hoteliers, sellers of bottled water are converging on the area where the hurricane struck and charging high prices for their work. And this is the price gouging. This is greed and luck. They're lucky because they happen to be in the right place at the right time, and they're gouging because they're greedy because they're charging high prices. And Sandel quotes Milton Friedman and his wife Rose Friedman, the famous book Free to Choose, which is an argument about the value of the market. And he says, well, he admits that, he says, yes, Milton Friedman thinks, says the market's unfair. He says the market's like life's unfair, the market's unfair. And Sandel is astonished, really. He says, this is a very surprising concession. Why would someone, surely everyone would think that justice is about giving people what they deserve. How can a defender of the market say, well, actually the market, sad to say, the market doesn't always give people what they deserve. But anyway, there we go. So my response, that's the kind of challenge. And I'm just going to go quickly through two parts of my response. One part, what I call the opportunity criterion, which is what the market does. And here the question is just thinking really only about the market in its ideal form, because in normative economics, welfare economics, one of the key results, some of the kind of grand theorems, is that a competitive market under ideal conditions would generate a Pareto efficient allocation of resources. It would, in a sense, maximize wealth, or it would produce something which gets to a state where you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. And so, since that's been the archetype or the canonical statement of what's good about the market, I want to try to see if I can create a corresponding one which has a different moral basis. And instead of saying the fundamental theorems of welfare are, in a sense, like Smith's invisible hand. The market is producing desirable results through it's a fortunate but predictable byproduct of self-interest. When I say our, this is myself and Ben McQuillan. Our answer is that a competitive market satisfies the, quote, opportunity criterion. And what the opportunity criterion asks for, you say for this, you've got to think of an exchange economy, but that's a simple type of economy. So people come along with endowments. They start off with initial endowments, and the market is about exchanging those endowments. And so you say, take any group of individuals. And when I say a group, this isn't a kind of like a social group. I mean, the group might be people in Britain who like chocolate, and people in Ghana who farm cocoa. I mean, that would count as a group. I mean, it's any group of individuals. If there's any transaction between them that involves only their own endowments, so there's a transaction which, given what they already own, they can achieve it by moving their endowments between person to person within their group. If there is such a transaction, that these people might, it's not saying they do want to make it, we're not referring to their preferences. Well, if it's at all plausible that they might want to make it, then in fact, they'll find that it's already possible. Sort of, well, if I as a chocolate-loving English person, if it's a plausible thing, if there was a transaction between me and the cocoa farmers of Ghana that would involve what I own and what they own, and if it's actually feasible, in fact, I mean, I'm already free. I'm already free to do it. At least I'm already free. And in fact, the sense in which I'm already free to do it is I can just go down to the supermarket and there on the shelves are bars of chocolate. And my opportunity set is the opportunity to buy the bars of chocolate. For the Ghanaian cocoa farmer, it's the ability to sell their beans at the Ghanaian market price. And each of us, not having never met each other, never consciously aware of this, in fact, we're being offered this opportunity to trade, and if we want to take it, we'll take it. So, and the way I put this more sort of popularly or more intuitively, you say, well, what would it mean to say I'm willing to pay for it? What does it mean to say I'm willing to pay for my bar of chocolate? It means I'm willing to give up what would induce other people to supply it. And what this opportunity criteria says is every individual is able to get whatever he wants and is willing to pay for. So if I just get up in the morning, I would like a bar of chocolate, or perhaps something I've never eaten before. I just suddenly think, oh, it'd be nice to have this. I want it, and I'm willing to pay whatever it costs other people to provide it with me. Then in fact, it's there already. The opportunity is there. I'm able to get it. And remember, this is not saying, given what my preferences are, it happens to be the case I can get what I want. It's whatever my preference happens to be, I can get what I want. So it seems to me like a very strong condition. Anyway, the key thing here is that the market achieves this. How do you read what that does in terms of virtue ethics? Well, I would say what it's telling you is that the market is a domain of voluntary interactions. It's an arena in which people who can achieve mutual benefit by interacting with other people voluntarily. So I would say in virtue ethical terms, the telos of the market, it's not actually money making, it's voluntary cooperation for mutual benefit. And here's what Luigi and I have written about in a paper some time back now. But the idea that there would be market virtues in the Aristotelian sense. Remember, the Aristotelian sense, a virtue is you have an activity of life. You have a supposed telos of it, is what this activity is, in a sense, there to achieve its function. You might say it's moral function, I suppose you'd say, and the virtues are the character traits that help each person to achieve this within that activity. So voluntary cooperation with mutual benefit is the telos of the market. The market virtues include such things as seeing other people as potential partners in achieving mutual benefit, not as rivals. So it's seeing other people as potential cooperators. Non-envy, non-malevolence, non-favoritism. Seeing others' prosperity with goodwill, because in a sense, if you had a zero-sum attitude to trade, then you'll be constantly thinking, as soon as someone comes and offers you a deal, you think, what's in it for them? Obviously, it's not a stupid thing to ask, but if you sort of think every time someone came to you and said, here's a possible trade, you thought, well, obviously, not just there's something in it for them, which is a mutual benefit, but that there must be something, the fact they want to pursue it means there must be something bad in it for me, then trade would never take place. So that this seeing other people as potential cooperators is part of the virtue of the market. And also seeing other people's prosperity with goodwill, because you can only trade usefully with people who've got something useful to trade. So the more successful other people are, in general, the better it is for you. And this is one of my, well, in fact, this is a favorite quote of mine from John Stuart Mill. Explains the title of my book. He says, commerce first taught nations to see with goodwill the wealth and prosperity of one another. Before, the patriot wished all countries weak, poor, and ill-governed but his own. Now he sees in their wealth and progress a direct source of wealth and progress of his own country. And then he said, well, referring to mercantilism, which was the idea that was, well, I mean, still see, I mean, Donald Trump would be an archetypal mercantilist, but mercantilism is the kind of idea of nations thinking of economic competition as zero sum. John Stuart Mill says, well, mercantilism overruled for centuries all sense of the general community of advantage which all commercial countries derive from the prosperity of one another. So I thought it's a market is a community of advantage. It's based on cooperation between individuals, and everyone benefits from other people's prosperity. And this, so market virtue in this sense involves something more than what Smith is attributing to the merchant. It's not just the merchant intends only his own gain and promotes an end that was no part of his intention. The virtuous merchant obviously intends that his transactions are beneficial to his trading partners as well as to himself. So he expects to benefit, but he expects to benefit others too. And so and it's not promoting an end that was no part of his intention. He's perfectly well aware of what he's promoting. He's promoting his good and the good of the people he cooperates with. And so there's no mysteriousness about this invisible hand, if you see it in this way. And it's the basis for a theory of business ethics, which is one of the things I'm currently working on. And so this leads to the thought of what's the morality of cooperation? If the market is about cooperation, what would be the morality of cooperation? And I say, well, here's my principle of mutual benefit. This is supposed to be the morality of cooperation in all domains of life, of which the market is one. So it's the basis not only for a market ethics, but it's the basis for a lot of other ethics of voluntary association. When participating with others in a voluntary interaction, voluntary means this takes place only if everyone who's a party to it chooses to enter. When participating with others in a voluntary interaction, for as long as others' behaviour is consistent with this principle, behave in such a way the other participants are able to satisfy normal expectations about the consequence of the interaction for them. And so think of the implications of this for Sandel's account of justice. Sandel thinks that justice is about rewarding virtue. But if market virtue is about seeking mutual benefit and playing your fair part in voluntary interactions, it can't completely reward virtue. There's a very simple reason for this. That it's to do with voluntariness. Market opportunities are not given to individuals, they're given to groups of individuals. So this, as in my principle of, opportunity criteria. Or to put this another way, the set of opportunities from which I can choose depends on the set of choices. Sorry, the set of opportunities which I can choose depends on the choices that other people make from their sets. Very simple example. Annie wants to buy a car. Bill and Charlie each have a car they would like to sell. What's Bill's opportunity set? Well, Bill's opportunity set, it would be nice for Bill if his opportunity set involved either holding on to his car or losing his car and getting a good price for it. But whether retaining his car is certainly in his opportunity set. But what price he can get for selling it depends on what choices Charlie makes. So Bill's opportunity depends on Annie's preference. And I mean, I got this example from actually a paper years and years I was writing about Sen and his notion of liberty. And you think of this in terms of marriage or romantic partnerships. It's the same thing. I don't know, was a few years ago, there was what was called the involuntary celibacy movement of men objecting that they couldn't get female partners. But the thought is, a liberal would say, well, I'm sorry, but your opportunity, there's equality of opportunity in the marriage market if each person's free to make or accept proposals as they see fit. And if your proposals and if your bill and your proposal is not accepted, and Charlie's proposal is, then that's unfortunate for Bill. But nevertheless, it's not in a liberal sense that he's got, properly said, he's got less opportunities than Charlie, because, or at least there's nothing unfair about it. This is, so in a sense, justice, because the market rewards people for conferring benefits on other people as they value them. So what you reward in the market is for providing things that other people are willing to pay for. It must be dependent on their preferences, and you can't expect. Sandel's surprised that Friedman concedes the market's unfair, but this is the price of voluntariness. If the market is going to be based on voluntary transactions, then you're dependent on other people because you're independent on their choices, and they're free to make their own choices. So life is unfair. Now, that's not to say that. That's my last slide. So yes, I think that's right. Let me just quickly. So market virtues, among the market virtues is recognition that effort isn't always rewarded. Successes and failures can be unmerited. It's taking responsibility for your past decisions, accepting the consequences, even if they're not the ones you hoped for. And there's a quote here from Hayek, which I'll skip over because it's a short time. But Hayek has saying this: it has to be admitted, what the market gives you would be unfair if the market were a person in a position to just trying to maximize welfare. But the way the market is, it's precisely because in the cosmos of the market, we all constantly receive benefits we have not deserved in any moral sense, that we're under obligation to accept undeserved diminution of our incomes. We can't expect the market to be fair. Now, that isn't to say there shouldn't be social insurance and redistribution of income. And indeed, I think that if the market economy is to be a community advantage, there has to be some general expectation that overall everyone can share in the wealth that markets create. And this is an essential part of being able to see others' prosperity with goodwill. And it's part of what, when Mill was talking about this, it's premised on his assumption based on his economic reasoning that free trade does tend to increase the wealth of all countries. But one final thought, which is a final thought, on the question of social insurance, one point in which I do agree with Sandel, in a more recent book, he endorses a principle of contributive justice. And contributive justice, as far as I can, he cited this, and this seems to be, as far as I can tell, this is the source of it. The source of the idea of contributive justice is a pastoral letter of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. And they say, social justice implies that persons have an obligation to be active. Social justice implies that persons have an obligation to be active and productive participants in the life of society, and that society has a duty to enable them to participate in this way. Work of adequate pay for all who seek it is the primary means for achieving basic justice in our society. So the thought is that the picture is that we ought to be seeing society as a good society, as a network of cooperative, voluntary cooperation for mutual benefit, that you have an obligation, each person, I'm not entirely sure I would quite say everyone has this is an absolute obligation, but certainly insofar as you get involved in this system, your obligation is to be a productive participant in the process of achieving mutual benefit, but also society has a duty to enable them to participate in this way. That in order to create a good society, we have to ensure that people who are able to be active and productive can get a reasonable standard of living from it. So that is really it. The normative core of my position is economic life ought to be understood as mutually beneficial cooperation between individuals, hence the title of my book, The Community of Advantage. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Bob.
You, Bob.
Did you know you want to say something? Do you want to add something?
No, just thank you, because I think is a very terrific synthesis of 30 years of research in economics and philosophy of Sugden, and to have the chance for our young colleagues to have a summary of so important, relevant theory of market, I think is really a huge chance for us. Thank you very much. And now go to our discussion. Thank you, Bob.
Okay. We should start with Valentina, and then Julia and Federico. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Sugden. This is a real honor for me commenting your speech. I hope to be up to this task. I really appreciate your speech because this is a very interdisciplinary work, and this is very, very interesting for us. I have two very brief considerations. On the one hand, I was wondering if we may apply this example of a community of mutual advantage for the vaccination campaign. On the other hand, just a thought-provoking consideration. In his open and closed impartiality, Sen distinguished between open and closed impartiality, and in particular he referred this first understanding to Smith's perspective, while he refers this second understanding to Rawls' perspective. In your community of advantage, you refuse a view from nowhere, you refuse a sort of open impartiality in favor of a contrarian approach in a behavioral and liberal background. But what about Arshani earlier formulation of the impartial spectator? I know that is a perspective from nowhere, but psychology acquire a very important role in this paradigm, and with some changes, a similar spectator could be part of your community of advantage with this very rich role of psychology. Thank you so much for this great opportunity.
Thank you. Do you want me to respond now? Or do you want all the commentators first and then responses later?
No, we can collect the other comments.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Julia.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a great joy to be here with you, and thank you especially to Professor Sugden for the presentation, and also for the thoughts and arguments for why the market economy is not necessarily something that needs to be run away from for someone who is also interested in pursuing or developing virtue. Rather, the way I'll just share a few reflections that I had as I was listening to this and previously reading some of the work of Professor Sugden. Rather, we can see the market economy as a place in which we can flourish under the condition that we use our individual freedom wisely, and freedom understood in a positive sense. This community of advantage where there's potential for great benefits to be made is a place where great good can also potentially arise. So I think especially things like creativity, individuality, responsibility for the other person, and importantly, all these things can be done in freedom, because as was pointed out in the presentation, the community of advantage, the interactions that take place in this model of a community are voluntary. So it's a place where a place of freedom to express all of these things. So from what I understand, the market can be a place for virtue, and by virtue we understand our deep happiness. Both a place where we can grow in virtue in the interactions that we undertake. So we saw examples of exchange, or examples of sort of relationships, or relationships that we can choose to enter into in their different forms. But it's also a place that, from what I understand, needs to be founded on virtue from the outset for it to sort of survive, and for the market economy to keep intact its original spirit, its original sort of aims and purposes. Because if not, the aims and purposes dissolve; they become lost. If the aim of the market is to serve each other as humans and individuals, if it's meant to be a place that allows us to flourish, as the virtue ethicists might propose in their models, then this can get lost and distorted, and the market then becomes something else. It becomes a self-serving place, and a place where the possibilities for individuals to flourish diminishes. So I think the point that we want to understand is that we're trying to achieve what are we trying to achieve in the market, and this is often the critique that hits the economics discipline, where the view of the market is based. Well, the economics is viewed as the basis of the market being an end in itself, and when this happens, the opportunities for virtue to be developed in individuals is evaded and corroded. Recently, I came across a quote by something that Pope Francis said, where he talks about creating a broader we, which is ever more responsible for each other, where we care for one another and for our common home too. And a market economy that could function on the basis of joint and mutual responsibility for each other can be a place in which virtue and good intentions that are directed towards the other person, the other party, the other side, is cultivated, and therefore in which individuals can also flourish. So I think the community of advantage that was talked about today by Professor Sugden, which is a community that's directed towards mutual benefit, is one way towards this mutual responsibility that Pope Francis is inviting us to. And so I wonder if Professor Sugden has some further thoughts on how we can cultivate a greater and growing sense of responsibility in looking for that mutual benefit and cooperation. And following on from this question, how can we move in practice towards a more virtuous market economy? I guess a big part of this relates to rediscovering virtue and what it really means in our modern world, because sometimes our view of virtue can be distorted. I guess virtue, as was presented today, it means acknowledging a certain vision of what's good and what can lead to authentic happiness. But I wonder also if, in moving towards a virtuous market economy, is it idealistic to think that individual transformation and will alone can transform it, or do we need to also look to a sort of parallel structural approach? And in this case, would it include regulations or some sort of directing of the market that makes the market economy a place where choosing the good is always an option to the individual. And even when that option to choose the good exists, I wonder if Professor Sugden also has any thoughts on what kind of incentives we can have that can gear us towards choosing the good that is also the the thing that is mutually good and the thing that brings mutual benefit. We heard a little bit about intrinsic motivations. So I guess my final question following on from this would be, how can we work these intrinsic motivations into the market economy? Not everything, we know that not everything that has value has a price. That effort, that virtue will not always be compensated or rewarded. And so what kind of incentives can lead to this furthering of a virtuous market economy, and how can we work in intrinsic motivation into that market economy model? Thank you very much for your thoughts on some of these things.
Thank you, Julia. Federico now.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Professor Sugden, for your presentation. And also, I really enjoyed reading some of your works to prepare for this. It has been a challenging job to be a discussant, I have to say, because I agree with a lot of things that you said. So, but I think that a good discussant should try to be like a reviewer too, in some sense. And so I in my questions, I will try to kind of look for the limitations if there are, or ask you about limitations and so on and so forth. But I have to say first that I think one very important thing that you did was take the virtue ethics critique seriously, which is something I'm an economist by training, and it's something we really don't do that often. So we tend to ignore this type of critiques to our profession, and I guess we really shouldn't, but it's a tricky job, and you did very well. Importantly, you showed that some of the important like neoclassical results in welfare economics tend to extend in a more kind of morally based view of the market, which is, I think, great and extremely important. Now, my questions are on two main points, I would say. One is the fact that you write in one of your papers that there cannot be full insurance, which is related with the relationship between market and justice. So the market cannot fully reward virtue and so on and so forth. Now, but on the other hand, in your presentation, you related with this concept of contributive justice. And then my question is, okay, is contributive justice something we can get within the realm of the market, or is it kind of something we need to get somewhere else, or in other words, in order to get true justice, do we need to go beyond the market? And so that means that in all those domains where we prefer justice to kind of efficiency, we should go. We should look for something else that is not the market, or not. That's my first question. Second question is more from a game theorist perspective, but I'll try not to be technical. I really like this idea of the market as a community of advantage, but that's not always possible, right? So I agree that the market is not always a zero-sum game, but some interactions are zero-sum games, or there are very strong incentives to behave in a way that is fairly different from the virtues that you mentioned, and those incentives seem to be rewarded. So how does this like goes together with your theory? And the last point is, even if there are mutual benefits, then the point is not only to achieve mutual benefits, but it's also how you distribute those benefits, right? So we can there is usually a spectrum, and we can move between different extremes. And of course, the way in which mutual benefits, even if they are there, the way in which they are distributed matters a lot. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this. And thanks a lot again.
Thank you, Federico. Bob, please.
Lisa, give me to reply.
Pardon?
So are you asking me to reply? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, all right. On Valentina, or quickly on the vaccination, and this is a public good. Being vaccinated is my contribution, as well as obviously benefits me, but it's a contribution to a public good of the community. There's because what I've been talking about is mainly about voluntary cases of public good. So this is more. I think the nearest equivalent there in terms of mutual benefits to say that when you say what is the argument, that the moral argument for a vaccination program, why should you, you go to someone and say you ought to be, the government tells you ought to get vaccinated. Why is it? What's the argument behind it? And there's a kind of altruistic sort of thought, which is, well, this is your duty to benefit others. But the mutual benefit thought is, well, you are benefiting from everyone else's contribution, and you're under an obligation to do your part too. So it goes beyond the voluntariness, but it is in tune with this idea that you should be willing to reciprocate other people's contributions to your benefit. But the deeper thought, I think, was the open and closed impartiality, and the central, and I do argue in the book against Sen on this, and I still feel that there's something different. My thoughts are contractarian. They're all about how a group of people could construe, well, I can say it's reciprocating the benefits to one another. So this thought of Sen's that we ought to be listening, we as a club, as a group, ought to be listening to these views from outside. Well, I must admit, I do tend to feel, well, in matters which are specific to us, then that's not a moral obligation. And so if if I'm dealing with you and we're happy with what we're doing together and we're not impacting on others, then other people are entitled to say what they like. But on the whole, the voices that do count are those that are within our group. So I do argue for, in a sense, closed impartiality. The impartiality of a voluntary society, a voluntary interaction ought to be impartial with respect to the people who are participants in it, but the people outside it, then they can say what they like, but ultimately they don't have the standing. Julia, well, this is very, very deep, what you were saying. And I think what I have to say is that this isn't, when Luigi and I were thinking about market virtue, we're certainly not wanting to say that market virtue is all there is to virtue. But what we're saying is there is a very important domain, if in economics, an extremely important domain, which is the domain of economics and the domain of the market. And the idea that this domain has its own virtues, and that it's grounded on that moral behavior within this domain is grounded in virtue, is important, but that doesn't. So I think that some of the things that you're thinking, when you say, when you say that the market is is good for creating creativity, individuality, responsibility, that I agree. And actually, there's there's a line of criticism of my work comes from Christian Schubert and Malte Dole, and so I'm saying that I'm always privileging the views of the people, the viewpoint of the people who are interacting, and not thinking about how they could be learning different ideas. And I think that you said, because you said at the end, what are we trying to achieve? And I think, well, actually, I've gone the famous, well, to me, a famous quote from Jim Buchanan, which is saying, well, in a sense, what we're trying to achieve in a market is just our own is just mutual benefit. And so the sense that I think that it's legitimate and reasonable to aspire to some of these greater ends, but I don't think you should expect those to be virtues of the market, and so that responsibility for your co-partners in trading is a business ethic. It's a virtue of, it is a market virtue, dealing fairly with the people in voluntary interactions with them. The idea of responsibility beyond that is a moral. I mean, it's entirely reasonable for the Pope and anyone to say this is something morally important. But I think we should separate that from what you can think of as being the virtue that the market works on. In the same way as you might say, there's virtue in the sporting virtues, you wouldn't expect sporting virtue to be concerned with some of these. Anyway, and when you say, what about regulation? Well, I think that, well, there's room for regulation in the, what I've been working on is regulation of markets to achieve market virtue, so to speak, to achieve fair dealing. I think, well, there's room. I think it's just it's different domain. You're going sort of beyond where I'm working. Federico, can there be contributive justice within the market? Well, this is one of the things that's sort of a big worry in a sense. I mean, I would have said that over the last, millennium, really, it's always been the case that although there's been technical progress, human labor has always ended up having a value. And so therefore the idea that almost everybody in society is in a position to contribute something of value to others has been a sort of fundamental property of the economic world. And so when that is the case, you may need income support schemes and what's the word? Taxes sort of you're effectively sort of people who work are getting it's a negative income tax, I can tell you. So you need, in order to achieve a reasonable distribution of income, you would need some kinds of social insurance and transfers. But the thought that more or less everybody can be a participant in the creation of mutual benefit has always been a feature. And that, given that, I think the idea of contributive justice is compatible with markets. But if as some people fear, we get into a situation where technological development means that a very large number of people's labor is actually of no use at all. And there's a horrible analogy with which I read somewhere who was saying, well, think about horses, and they say think about horses in the up to middle of the 19th century were horses everywhere doing all sorts of useful jobs, and now most of the cart there's no useful jobs for them. And so it's, in a sense, it is worrying. And I just sort of desperately hope that I sort of like to have I still believe that this will continue to be the case, that labor will be useful. But we'll have to wait and see. I think I better stop there. Sorry. But anyway, thank you very much for your comments. There's much more I could say if I had several hours, but.
Thank you, Bob. I have a question, if I can, a small one. At a certain point, you quoted Mill, if I'm not wrong, when he says that to see the market as a community of advantage, we have to see others' wealth in a goodwill. Mm-hmm. And we know that, from neurosciences and behavioral economists, that inequity causes very negative reactions. So in a unjust distribution of wealth, it could be very difficult to see others' wealth, especially if you're in a disadvantageous position to see others' wealth in a goodwill. But if this is a precondition, what kind of process you see to reach this this goal? It's a matter of culture, education, social norms, or what do you think?
I would say there's two thoughts to me there. One thought is the one that comes from Mill himself, and he says that what is it? Well, he talks about the social feelings of mankind. He says, well, what does, I mean, he's actually utilitarian, but he's saying he's proposing a utilitarian morality. But he says, whenever you propose a morality, what is your morality? What's morality ultimately founded on? And Mill says, any morality is based on conscience, and it's the social feelings of mankind. It's feeling, and he said, well, what is it that creates that? And he says, well, what creates it is cooperation for mutual benefit. So it's being brought up in a society, and indeed a family, where people cooperate. You learn to cooperate. You learn that you benefit by doing things that are valuable to others because of this. That's where this. So I don't think it is necessarily true to say that that this is well established that people's natural view of the world is zero sum. I think it's natural that. I mean, I think most people will think about chimpanzees and hunter-gatherers and say, well, actually, cooperation and self-interest are kind of the two kind of fundamentals of human psychology. And what Mill thought is what brings forward the cooperative sense, the ability to see other people's prosperity with goodwill, is living in a society where everyone does benefit from everyone else's corporate. So then I think the answer to your second thought is, well, if the distribution of income becomes too unequal, and particularly when it's becoming more unequal over time, and the relatively poor are not benefiting from economic progress at all, then that doesn't sustain that thought. And so I think that's part of the reason why there has to, in order to have a sense of a community advantage, you have to be able to, it's only possible for people to have this, not only possible, what enables people to have this perception that they live in a world where, based on cooperation, and that you can see other people's prosperity with goodwill, is recognizing that you benefit from that. And so I think that for what Rawls calls psychological stability, society has to ensure that everyone does share in the benefits. And that's part of what taxation, in a sense, is. So taxation should be part of what gives that that assurance. Is when you think of the person who's earning an enormous income, you should think, well, actually, yes, that's very nice, really, for me, because if this person is not evading their taxes, if they're paying their taxes, then actually I am benefiting from this. So I think you do have to have that. It's not just a psychological perception; it has to be sort of some reality to it too. Anyway, so.
If I, Vittorio, can add just one word to say thank you, and also to say that this idea of mutual benefit as the tails of the market is very also in line, very consistent with the idea of fraternity of Pope Francis in the last encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, because also Bob worked on fraternity, but the idea that to look at the world as a network of mutual beneficial transactions, not only in the market, but in civil society, I think is very compatible with, consistent with the idea of fraternity. That is one of the key words of also the economy of Francesco of Assisi, and Francesco the Pope. And just to make this note more evident, but just to say a huge thank you to Bob, to all the discussants, to Vittorio, and to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigina. I think there's a Valentina Rotondi.
Yep.
Well, okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Sugden. Thank you so much, Vittorio. Thank you so much, Luigino, but also Federico, Valentina, Giulia, and then, of course, Maria, Paolo, Isa, Lourdes, and then the two translators, which have done a fantastic job during this lesson. So thank you very much to Alvaro, and thank you very much to Alejandro. I will close this fantastic lecture, and thank you so much, Professor Sugden, once more, by recalling you our next meetings. So just quick and important things you should note. First of all, we will not have a workshop on July the 14th, but this workshop will be on July the 28th. So in 2 weeks after the scheduled workshop. The next workshop then should be on July the 28th. And on July the 28th, unfortunately, we will not have Professor Bicchieri lesson, but this will be displaced on September the 15th. Last and not least, on July the 21st, we will have Yves Capello, professor, giving us a fantastic lecture on something relating to financial markets. So don't miss these next meetings. Once more, thank you very much to the discussants, of course, to Professor Sugden, to Vittorio, to Luigino, and to all of you connecting here and connecting through YouTube. Thank you so much and see you. Bye-bye.
And thank you very much for inviting me. A very, very interesting discussion. Thank you.